I didn't have the best relationship with my mom growing up. Actually, I'm gonna just be real with you. I'm not even gonna sugarcoat it. It was terrible. I spent half my childhood worried about getting my ass kicked. And when I say ass kicking, I'm not talking about a little spanking or something like that. I'm talking about assaults with stuff like shoes, plastic bats, coat hangers. I got a little scar over my left eyebrow that's faded now, but that was from the first time or the second time I got stitches, and that was from my mom. And I spent the other half of my childhood like as much time as I could out the house, isolated in my room. And this whole time, I'm worried about stuff that no kid should have to worry about, like getting evicted, even though my mom always had money for cigarettes, a case of beer, and some weed. When I became a teenager, though, I was rarely at home. I played sports after school and got jobs. My friends' families knew where I was from and what I went through, so they didn't mind when I randomly showed up for dinner 5 nights a week, or I spent weekends and holidays there, or even when I basically moved in over the summer. Things didn't get much better between my mom and I when I became an adult, and I didn't really have any obligation to listen to her anymore, especially since I wasn't under her roof. We always got into arguments about everything, including this really big blow up that happened. It was like either Thanksgiving or Christmas when I was 19. I know that for sure. That made us not speak to each other for like 3 years, and it was over some money she had been stealing from me. But we eventually made up. And then she moved this girl into her house that she had been seeing me, the girl, and then she got pregnant by some other dude. And my mom treated the kid like it was her kid, and it was all crazy and awkward. And I distanced myself again. And then when I lost my fight on TV, she told me that she made $100 because she bet against me because she just knew I was going to lose. There are a lot of other stories and examples that I could use, but I want to make the point that while maybe using the word hate is too strong and mostly for clicks, I'll admit, there was clearly some strong agitation and tension between my mother and I. And as much as I want to say that a lot of that is on me, taking personal responsibility, I also know that my mom had a lot of resentment towards me and that a lot of her behavior and actions towards me compared to my sister didn't do anything to dissuade me of that idea. Besides, I'm the child and she's the adult. It's not on me to make sure that I feel good about my childhood and how my mother feels towards me. Now, I know there are some people out there who can relate to this. I've had people who can't imagine having a mom like this say some crazy god awful stuff like, that's your mom. Of course she loves you. Or you only have one mom. Or she gave you life. You need to be grateful. And if you relate to this, you know what I'm about to say, man. I hate it when people say stuff like that, like it made things better. On top of that, it totally dismisses that there is obviously a reason why I felt so bitter, making it seem like I should just be grateful to exist, even if a lot of that existence, especially my formative years, were fairly miserable. The most insulting and dismissive thing some people have said is, you ain't did her in jail, so obviously she did something right. That one used to actually make me pause and think, and then I remembered a lot of the other influences in my life that helped me avoid the path of a lot of the other family members in my life, or members of my family. Uh, and then made me realize, a lot of my life has turned out the way it's turned out, despite her influence, not because of it. It's like that old Chris Rock joke where he says, N words, and I'm saying N words because I don't want this video to get demonetized. Because N words always want some credit for some shit they're supposed to do. And N word will say some shit like, I ain't never been to jail. And you're not supposed to go to jail. You low expectation and have an M effort. Or they'll say something like, I take care of my kids. So what? You want a cookie? That's basically how I felt when people would say stuff like that to me. And then my mother was admitted to the hospital in September 2021. And she'd never see life outside of that hospital again. She died on December 16th, 2021, a week before Christmas. I held her hand as we took her off life support, and she slowly faded with her eyes wide open, seeming to recognize my sister and my wife and I, but not being able to say anything or make sense of what was happening. When my dad died in 2003, it was unexpected, it was sudden, and even though I wasn't there, it made me cry. But that was more related to just the shock of knowing that someone died. Or maybe it was because people expected me to cry. But my relationship with my father wasn't bad, it just simply didn't exist. I didn't really have anything to cry about. I talk more about it in my videos about growing up without a father, which I'll link to in the description. But when my mom died, there was no crying. Even though I fully admit that being in the room with someone as they take their last breath is one of the most emotionally strenuous things I've ever done. But rather than sadness, what I felt was more of a combination of anger and disappointment. Disappointment because it didn't have to be this way. This was totally avoidable. I always talked to my mom about taking care of her health, eating better, drinking less, and just quitting the smoking entirely, but she never listened. She just snapped at me and it turned into another fight, so I stopped bringing it up. I wish she had listened because she didn't even make it to 60 or get to meet her grandson. She actually didn't even get to know he was on his way. And I was also angry because I felt like even in dying, my mom forced me to handle the brunt of her problems in life, forcing me to be the parent when she was supposed to be. I told her that not making my sister learn to live outside her help was setting her up for failure. Now my sister's doing well, but for the year after, she was faced with constant trouble making rent and other life, terrible choices. And it feels selfish even saying the next part, but I had to change my entire holiday plans with the family I was building because of this. But then came my mom's funeral. And that was the first point where my thoughts and my feelings about my mom, feelings I had harbored for the entirety of my adult life, started to change. And I started to forgive her. I've talked before about how I grew up in the public housing projects with my mom on and off of welfare. But the year I started high school, she got a job as a secretary at Wilkinsburg High School. And if anyone watching this went to Wilkinsburg High School and remembers Miss Kathy, that was my mom. Now, that's a rough area, almost as rough as where I actually grew up, and that's really important to the story. At her funeral, there were a lot of young adults who showed up who had interacted with my mom during her 15 years there. As many of her coworkers also showed up. They came out to show some love. They had more than the typical nice things to say, though. The students told me stories of how my mom showing them that she cared, that they didn't get in trouble, made them think twice about doing something dumb in the streets. One girl in particular told me a story of how my mom helped her get her father convicted because he was SAing her, and my mom helped her not only get him convicted, but when he got put behind bars, mom let her live with her until she became an adult, so she didn't become a ward of the state. And I think hearing those stories reminded me that when my mom and I had our issues, many of them stemmed from the stresses of her life. While she exposed me and my sister to physical abuse from a guy she dated on and off when we were younger, a dude we actually went to visit in jail multiple times, she always told me she hated when I told that story because she felt so bad about it. I never really believed her, mostly because she beat the hell out of us too. But maybe helping that girl was her way of making amends, the best way she could. At the very least, hearing that story helped me to see that my mom wasn't really a monster. It reminded me that she had some good qualities. The change in my feelings towards my mother didn't happen instantly, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized something important. I was poor, I lived in the projects, I was bullied, I was abused. I thought all of this was normal until I got to high school. I went to a high school across town with kids from the middle and upper classes. As I watched how they lived and the relationships they had with their families, I got really angry. I wasn't jealous. I simply didn't understand why my mom would have me if she couldn't afford to give me opportunities as simple as living in a safe neighborhood. But when I started studying forgiveness, I knew I needed to forgive my mother because I harbored an incredibly poisonous and weak thought. I thought I lacked opportunities and had destructive tendencies because of the environment she raised me in. Now, whether this is true or not is irrelevant. What is relevant is that I let this thought take hold of my mind. I would work myself up thinking of all the ways in which my upbringing gave me a short stick in life. I'd remember everything my mom did or didn't do and view it through the lens of this destructive thought. It was all her fault. After all, I didn't ask to be born, so I should have had better since she brought me into this world. And part of the anger and resentment I have for her throughout my life is that I desperately wanted things to be different for me. I wanted to have a different life, a different family, a different anything. Now I love myself now, and all the things that I've been through, for better or worse, made me who I am. But at one point, I didn't want to be me. This changed when I made a small leap of intellectual reasoning that allowed me to forgive her. Now, I talk more about this change way more in depth in my book, Hard Lessons from the Hurt Business, Boxing and the Art of Life. I've linked to the page where you can read a free sample chapter or buy it in the pinned comment. But what was this shift in my thinking that I made? Rather than think that my shitty childhood, or rather than think about and focus on the shitty parts of my childhood, I focused on the positive things my mother did. I carry many of those good habits with me today, including good manners with strangers and a love of books. This allowed me to look at my past in a slightly different light. Now, this doesn't mean that there weren't tremendous negatives and they didn't have an effect on me. It simply meant that I wasn't going to feed the hatred that had infected my mind and heart. Seeing the positives brought me to a powerful conclusion. My mother did the best for me that she could, given what she knew. You know, although her actions were often destructive and detrimental, they were never intended to hurt me in particular. It was simply all she knew. I was collateral damage of her emotional and psychological struggles. I started to see that it wasn't personal. That's something that's difficult, if not impossible, for a child, teenager, or even a young adult to understand. Hell, sometimes as a fully grown 40-year-old man, I still have to remind myself of this. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be consequences, repercussions, or barriers put up to deal with the people who have hurt you, especially when they're as close as a parent or guardian. But once you realize that you're in the path of their problems and not the cause of them, it really helps deal with the resentment. Grudges and blame are a fun game, but they're a game you can't win. Once I realized that it was just the best she knew, then I thought, well, who was responsible for teaching her that? Her mother? And if this was the case, then who raised her wrong? This type of thinking never ends because it's in the past, and even if you do find the source of the dysfunction, there's nothing you can do about it. You hold grudges because you're looking for the source of your personal grief. You want the debt to be repaid, but that's impossible. Fixation on the person convinces you that if they can do something, perhaps it will reverse what's happened, but that's not the case. It'll never happen. Unfortunately, human beings are sometimes shit and do shitty things, and nothing can undo their shitty actions. You're setting yourself up for misery if you expect an external resolution to your internal feelings. Instead, forgive the debt. Now, forgiveness isn't always instant. In fact, it usually isn't. It's a multifaceted process that takes place over time. But understanding one thing will accelerate the process. You are holding on to a grudge against the action, not the person who committed it. This is the primary reason why revenge and eye for an eye justice don't resolve the emotional damage. You don't forgive the person because they deserve it. You don't forgive the person because you deserve to. You forgive because it's the only way to cure your heart of hatred of others, and most importantly, yourself. Now, my mother died 1 year before my son was born. I still struggle with forgiving her, but I know that I have to continue trying, or else I risk being consumed by anger and resentment. Avoiding this fate is why you practice forgiveness. It's why I practice forgiveness. You don't do it to make the other person feel better. You don't even do it to make yourself feel better, although that's often a benefit. You practice forgiveness so that the past events lose grip over your present emotions, so you don't do something in the future that ruins your life. Victims of childhood abuse are more likely to suffer adverse outcomes in the future for several reasons. Often it's because they're destitute, impoverished, or incarcerated because they were trying to fill an emotional void caused by growing up without receiving guidance, protection, love, and support. Whether it be committing violent crimes or consumption of addictive substances, these actions are motivated by a need to belong. However, anger and a loss of hope also often motivate these actions. When most of your experiences involve disappointment and harm, it's easy to become bitter and sad. If a person spends the first decades of their life in a constant state of fight or flight, but with nowhere to run and nowhere to defend themselves, it's easy to see how one loses faith in humanity and becomes incensed towards it. Studies show that early life stress alters brain structure and function in ways that precipitate mood disorders like anxiety and depression. I've talked about this a lot in some other videos. These changes in your brain lead to changes in how you perceive the world. Now, I wish my mom were alive so I could tell her that I forgive her for everything. And not only because it would grant me peace of mind. Forgiveness is for me, remember? But I took the path to this place of emotional peace that helped me to see my mother in a different light. Now I see my mother as a flawed woman who did the best she could to raise her children despite the physical and sexual abuse she endured growing up and the effect it left on her. Now that I have a son, I recognize that as a single mother, she was doing the best with the little resources and abilities in her possession. Now, here's the thing you got to remember about forgiving someone. You also don't do it to mend the relationship, and you don't even do it to make peace with the other person. You do it because if you don't, your peace of mind is controlled by something or someone else. And if you think it's weak to forgive, you got to ask yourself what you're going to do when someone dies that you have a problem with. There's nothing you can do about it but be pissed off against the ghost. Every time you think about that ghost, it will control your emotions, and there's nothing you can do but be angry and stew. People always push back and say that they'll feel better when the other person gets theirs, but I can tell you that even for the worst atrocities committed against you, it just doesn't work like that. You might feel temporary relief, but the research and loads of anecdotal evidence and stories show that you never actually get even. You feel like you have for a moment, but then later on you feel worse. And if you doubt that, something bad happening to someone else doesn't undo the emotional damage you suffered. If anything, it makes it worse because now if you have any sort of conscience or sympathy, you feel bad that something bad has happened to someone else, or the people around them who might not have had anything to do with it. Now that you know how I got over dealing with this, watch this video right here if you want to learn even more about the experience of being raised by a single mom. If that was you, then you'll definitely want to watch.